and thank you for joining. And welcome to the webinar that will discuss very important and very interesting topics, generational perspectives on Georgian politics. My name is Natia Chankotadze, and I will briefly introduce the program on Georgian studies and also the facilitator for today's conversation. Georgia program at Harvard University started in January 2022. And it's the first and still only program in the United States that works around the country of Georgia. The program does multiple different things, including teaching the language, conducting the research on different topics, including the Georgian diaspora, transitional period of Georgia from the Soviet Union into the independence, and multiple other projects. Obviously, there are multiple events throughout the semester, though this fall, 2025, has been a little slower and unusual period for the program, with fewer in-person and also fewer online events. And there are conferences and collaborative projects and joint initiatives that program was able to do until summer 2025. 2025 has been a little challenging period for the Georgia program, and probably 2026 will continue to be the challenging. So I really urge everyone who is joining this webinar to sign up for our email list, to follow up on events that the announcements that the program will make in December, in January, and ongoing months. Before I introduce Professor Jones here, I also want to highlight the few important announcements from the program side. One, as I said, please do sign up for the email list so we can be in touch as often as possible. The another important thing is that a Georgian language class is still available for not only Harvard students, but anybody else who is interested in studying Georgia in spring 2026, and the registration process is still going on. You will see the link in the chat, so please help us to spread the word so people who want to study Georgian language can register. Another announcement is that and some of you probably know that Harvard University recently has purchased 1743 Georgian Bible, which is a quite rare book and very important acquisition at the Houghton Library, and that Bible will be displayed at the Houghton Library in spring 2026. So anybody, Georgians or anybody interested in Georgia, are more than welcome to come to Cambridge, Harvard. This will be open to public. And the last note is that in summer 2025, the FC Center and Harvard University established the Program on Georgian Studies Fund, which we will soon send out more official and more details about the fund, but we would really like to Georgians and the Friends of Georgia to know about the fund and to help us to popularize it and to find potential partners and supporters and donors to the fund. With all of this, I'm going to introduce Professor Jones here, who will make the introduction to the webinar and why he decided to initiate this topic for the conversation. Many of you know that there is a very difficult time for Georgia for multiple reasons, and I'm sure today's conversation will touch a lot of topics because both of these speakers are speaking from Tbilisi. Professor Stephen Jones is the founding director of the Program on Georgian Studies until summer of 2024, and now he is the chair of the advisory board. Professor Jones has PhD from London School of Economics and Politics, and he has taught at the universities of California, London, and Oxford. He was a research fellow at Harvard also, and the senior associate member of St. Anthony College, Oxford. Professor Jones has been a professor at the Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts before he actually moved to Harvard. He widely published about the Georgian history, Georgian politics, and his books include The Socialism in Georgian Colors, War and Revolution in the Caucasus, Georgia: A Political History Since Independence, The Birth of Modern Georgia, and countless other articles and opinion papers. So I'm very grateful, Stephen, that you initiated this conversation, then you continue to be with the Georgia program, and I'm passing the virtual microphone to you to introduce the speakers and tell more about the event. And again, thank you everyone who has joined the webinar.
Natya, thank you very much. Splendid to have these two wonderful guests with us. We're going to explore this whole question of generational impact on Georgian politics, and I think many people who have been observing it from afar have seen the different age groups scattered in Georgia's streets, struggling, if you like, to preserve their rights and democracy in Georgia. And what we want to do today is to explore that situation. Let me first, though, thank the two guests here for coming and talking to us. I'm going to introduce them both. We've got about 90 minutes or less than 90 minutes now. After I've introduced them, I'm going to say a few words myself and then give them 5 questions. And I've told them that I'm going to be pretty strict in terms of the amount of time I'm going to let them talk in terms of their answers. That should bring us hopefully to something like 1 o'clock or so, and then we can open it up to your questions, and you can place your questions in the Q&A, and we will field them to both Tedo and to Gabriel. Let me just say a few words about them. Tedo Japaridze has a many storied career as a public servant in various Georgian government agencies. He's spanned more than 3 decades, starting with the position of First Deputy Chair of the UNESCO Affairs Council, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia, and that was in 1989. He then served as a Foreign Policy Security Issues Advisor to President Shevardnadze. And in 1994 through 2002, he was appointed as Georgia's ambassador to the USA. And that's when I first met him and brought him to Mount Holyoke College twice to talk about the current situation as it was then in Georgia. He also, in 2002 became the Secretary of the National Security Council, and late in 2004, Georgia's Minister of Foreign Affairs. I could say much more about the activities of Tedo Japaridze, who's really been a most influential figure in Georgian politics over the last 3 decades, and of course represents, let's say, a different generation. He grew up in the Soviet period, and that's what we want to explore, his perspective, given his background and his own experience in Soviet and post-Soviet politics. Gabriel Chubinidze, my former student, very proudly I can say that. He was a master's student of mine. He completed his master's degree in modern Georgian history at Elias State University, where he's currently the program coordinator. Alongside this work, he is actively engaged in research. He's focusing primarily on the late Soviet period, and I've read his work, and it's excellent work. His main areas of interest include the Georgian national movement, Georgian Civil War, and the Abkhazian War. His master's thesis was titled The Abkhazian War, Chaos and Involved Sides, and it examined the Georgian Civil War and the Abkhazian War, emphasizing how the chaos at the center affected the periphery. I could again say more. He's published quite extensively on labor issues in Georgia. Also, he wrote an excellent piece on the Trans-Caucasian Railway project that was started in Georgia in the late 1980s. So welcome, Gabriel. Very, very good to have you. And of course, you're both here because, I guess, to some extent, because of your age. But let me talk a little bit about generations and how they impact politics. Our politics today is, certainly in the popular media at least, is saturated with the idea that generational cohorts, from baby boomers to millennials and Gen Z, are the drivers of political change. In many ways, these generational categories seem commercially generated, focused on the buying habits of different aged consumers. But how useful are they in understanding political change among ordinary citizens? This is a serious debate in political science today, with people like Paul Abramson and Mark Franklin measuring what they see as patterns of political behavior shaped by major events and economic shocks. They're opposed by others like Jeffrey Evans and James Tilley, who argue that class or urban-rural differences are much better predictors of political attitudes than age cohorts. Georgia has a long experience of generational conflicts. Ilia Chavchavadze fought Revaz Eristavi and Grigol Orbeliani over Georgian literary forms. Noy Jordania, who led the Samidasi in the 1890s, confronted Ilia Chavchavadze and the Mayor Dasi over strategies of national liberation. Then we have a generation of Georgian Bolsheviks who emerged in the 1920s, who demolished everything Jordania's generation had tried to create in the First Republic. More recently, Georgian politics has been analyzed by generational approaches. Saakashvili and his Western-educated peers broke with the Soviet-trained politicians of the Shevardnadze era and were seen as youthful modernizers who brought us a revolution. Watching Georgian politics today, generational allegiances are used to help us understand different forms of political competition. And as new generations incorporate new methods of protest and civil resistance. But the question remains, how realistic or helpful are these generational differences in understanding Georgian politics? Generations, of course, are heterogeneous. They're divided by class, by place, by gender, by education. To help us examine the impact of generations on Georgian politics since independence, we've asked both Tedo and Gabriel, who've been politically active over the years and who are from widely different generational cohorts, to reflect on this question. How important are generations in Georgia's political evolution over the last 3 to 4 decades? And I'm going to start this conversation with my first question of 5. And I'm going to start with Tedo, and then pass it on to Gabriel. So the first question is, how would you describe your own generation? What were the major events, both in Georgia and more broadly in the Soviet Union and beyond, that defined you and your generation? And in what ways do you think your generation has evolved and makes it distinct from other generations? And so I'm going to turn that first question over to Tedo, give him 5 minutes to answer that, and then ask Gabriel for his opinion. Tedo, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Always big pleasure to be back at Harvard. Grateful, of course, to Georgia Study Center, to Natia for organizing this event. A conversation, I would call it, conversation between Gabriel and me, moderated by you, Stephen. And I think it's very important, very important. However, let's wait how it develops. Excuse my voice, I'm fighting a bit of a cold. Who knows what, maybe the age, but still, I'll try to share my thoughts, my observations regarding your question. I'm speaking in my personal capacity, so everything I'm going to say will reflect only my own observations, my musings, which I call that way, of a person who's been watching and participating in politics, Georgian politics, and policy making, and in general, public life for over 30 plus years, 35 years. But today, I am a very angry person. I'm angry because it is difficult to see how much of what my generation of politicians, policymakers, diplomats but we fought for our unwavering Western orientation, our Western trajectories, paths toward NATO, the European Union, and how all that has been steadily undermined, maybe even demolished entirely. So I'm indeed really very angry in that regard. And we witness what? Polarization, which cuts, deeply, and not only through Georgian society, but also in our relations with international partners. And in that regard, polarization in Georgia is more than political or societal, as we say, but it has become way of life. So back to your question, Stephen, it's not easy, first of all, to compress everything I've watched for 30 plus years and whatever I have witnessed in 5 minutes, but I will try. I was born, as you already said, in 1946, so I belong to what you might call the Georgian branch of the post-war baby boom generation. But unlike Western baby boomers, we did not grow up in optimism. My generation grew up in families carrying the unhealed wounds of the early Soviet decades. You just already mentioned them. In my own family, this was painfully actual. Both sides of my family lived through the 1924 Bolshevik purges, the terror of 1937, and they were stories whispered at family tables. I remember that, as kid. Silences that shaped our childhood. One of my first personal direct political memories came during the unrest of March 1956. I don't know when Gabriel was born. When I was just 10 years old, I remember crowds shouting Lenin, Stalin, later, Jude, it was, Chinese official who traveled to Georgia, without naturally understanding who these figures were or why people were protesting. And growing up with these memories meant that my generation entered adulthood already in tension with the Soviet system. Many of us were quietly, instinctively, I would say, anti-Soviet. We had no idea what anti-Soviet means, but we were. Not only because of ideology, we had no idea about ideology, but because the system had left deep marks in our families. It was very much, personal. And, my generation didn't believe the mythology. We had lived with the consequences. That was one of the interesting, features of my generation. Later came April 9th, 1989, which was a breaking point.
Looks like we may have lost Tedo temporarily, hopefully. So I'm going to ask Gabriel to give us his understanding. So what Tedo's been talking about is how his generation was shaped by the silences. Tedo, we can't hear you. We can't hear you very well.
Wounded born, skeptical of grand narratives and deeply aware of how fragile institutions can be. So we learn politics through textbooks, speaking about, Western politics. But the realities were much different, very complex and very messy. This maybe distinguishes us from younger generation of Gabriel. They start from sovereignty. We watched a state dissolve. I mean, state, Soviet Union. They expect institutions to function. We spent years improvising them from scratch.
Right.
And their political instincts are shaped by freedom and global openness, and ours were shaped by trauma, memory, cautiousness, and the long shadow of an evil empire. So I would answer.
Right. Okay, Tedo, that was a wonderful summary. We lost you, unfortunately, briefly, so we didn't hear your entire conversation, but we got the gist of it, definitely. And I would like Gabriel to respond to that in terms of Tedo's characterization of the differences between the two generations, and your generation in particular, that had, let's say, less to navigate in terms of your political behavior. You were connected with the international community, for example, in a much more in a much closer fashion, and you were dealing with a society where you didn't have to keep silent. Can you contrast your experience with what Tedo just said?
Stephen, excuse me, before Gabriel, excuse me, just to summarize what I said, because my just voice, disappeared. So my generation, whatever behavior, perceptions, worldview was impacted by empire. We lived in that empire.
Right, right.
In difference with Gabriel, which
right, a
was
post-empire, but
right,
right.
Yeah.
Gabriel,
Hmm?
your idea on this.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you very much for inviting me here, and it is a really a big honor. My reflection will be that right now in Georgia we are having a really interesting time because Georgia, in my generation, have never experienced what is the autocratic system. And to start from the time of perestroika, we shall understand that even during the perestroika, Georgian Communist Party was not such harsh, such is a Georgian dream. And it is really interesting because we as a society, we don't know how to coexist in autocratic regime. We have zero experience, and also I think that Georgian dream also do not have an experience, and they also don't know how to be an the autocratic government. Yes, and that's why this gives us one very good sign that we are not afraid, and we are not taking seriously what GD is doing, because we don't believe that Georgia they can build an autocratic regime. Yeah, and Tedo said that in 1956 people went into the streets right to protest this de-Stalinization policy. And I think that in that moment, people in reality did not have a memory of a terror, and that's why they were not afraid of the regime. For example, if we take the 1978 protest, we see that still students who went to protest against the Soviet new constitution, they were not also afraid because they did not have a memory about how these things is ended into the 1956. And also, if we shall remember what happened during the national movement time, we see that when the people went into the streets, people also did not. People's memory was going through the events what happened into 1978, and they remember that after the protest, Soviet regime stepped back. Yes, and of course, when I'm saying that we don't have an experience how to live into autocratic regime, but it is much true because we have never, we don't know how it is, because no one knows what it is. We don't know how to live like Russians. Even if we take an example from the 60s or 70s, we see that in Georgia during the Soviet time, in Georgia, you could find way more freedom than in Russia in the 60s or in the 70s. Because in Georgia, of course, this can be explained that Georgia was a province of the empire, and of course, empire would not be as harsh as it was in Russia or in Ukraine. But still, in Georgia, even Communist Party, I mean, Georgian Communist Party was approving these deviations. And of course, even Georgian Communist Party have never tried to be an autocratic. So I mean, my main answer would be that we, new generation, who we are born, even in the first half of the 18th, we don't know what is the autocratic rule and how to coexist with it. And this will be a huge problem for the GD. And of course, this can be, yeah.
Okay, Gabriel, thanks. So, I mean, I hear you both talking about we, my generation and so on. Of course, there are some critiques of that in terms of an understanding that generations, of course, are multifarious. There are multiple opinions and multiple classes and so on in each generation. But what I want to try and get a little bit more concrete, if I may, and think about how you think your time, your generation, if you like, was shaped in terms of its attitudes towards political institutions today. Your experience, I think Tedo already touched on that, but how do you think your generation, your experience makes you reflect today on your relationship with institutions in Georgia, with leaders, with the law, with the question of protest? How did that impact you, for example, Tedo? And how do you look at Georgian politics today based on those experiences you had in the Soviet period, for example?
The Soviet period, I would say, made me very skeptical towards, institutions. And frankly speaking, my generation, people whom I know, my friends, my family members, we just did not trust these institutions, Soviet ones. We used to live with them, but we didn't trust. It was kind of, and unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we brought along, this skeptical experience along with us. So we are the same way skeptical about the current institutions. And here is very important, dilemma, if we speak about Georgian political life, that and Gabriel knows, and also, of course, and everybody who listen to us, that we Georgians, we love, admire our own country. Georgia, we can die for Georgia. But we're very skeptical towards, Georgian state, which is now independent. And there would be no Georgia as a country without, strong democratic, institutionalized, state. But we're so much, skeptical. We're suspicious. We sometimes hate, this state. And I think that's and of course, state treats us, the same way, in a very brutal, ugly way. So here is I do not want to how to formulate this. This is kind of a two-way street, and we are squeezed between us, who are skeptical about the current state, which is, independent Georgia, and the state itself is also very much, just brutal and
Right.
whatever, towards its own citizens.
So, Gabriel, I mean, a different generation, a generation that experienced a lot of protest because there has been the possibility, there's been the political space for protest. How does would you argue, for example, that the different characteristics of the state that you've encountered have changed your attitudes towards the possibilities of political change in Georgia? and what methods you can use to enforce that political change?
Certainly, I think that my generation maybe knows how kind of government and how kind of state do we want. But I still think that even my generation does not know how to make it and how to build it. I mean, we know how to protest, but in fact, our political class is so far from the people's needs. I mean, during the national movement's time, for example, my father's generation, we are saying that first we should be an independent, and then we will build a state. But right now, I mean, but of course they could not do it because we are not thinking about the state building. I mean, their main goal was to be an independent and not a state building. But my generation, we understand, as I said, what do we want from the state? But we don't know how this independence should work and how we must build a state and what is a state building. We know that we need democratic state institutions, but we don't know how to make it. And of course, as I said, the Georgia political class, I think, lost the touch with people, and this is the reason why GD is winning. So I think that I mean, I don't have a clear answer because for me it is also a little bit blurry because it's not because right now in Georgia we don't have to think how to build a state because right now we in Georgia are trying to survive and try to save Georgia in a long run. So right now, I mean, no one is thinking how to build the state. We are just thinking how to save our country from the long autocratic regime.
Okay. Let me ask you another, both of you now. Tedo, you want to come back on that?
Stephen, and the problem, I fully agree, with Gabriel because I watch, this Gabriel's generation and their experience, their, misunderstanding or just problems, how to tackle but our generation also experienced the same problems. We had no idea how to deal with this independence and freedom. And when it jumped on us, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were independent, but we did not know, my generation, how to live with this independence, and we had no idea, we had no experience, we had no knowledge. And I think in that regard, my generation and Gabriel's generations have been, still experiencing the same kind of problem. Georgians have not learned how to live with its independence. I'm not speaking about freedom because we still need to go, a long way before we can say that Georgia, we just really understand what freedom is about.
Let me ask this question then. Older generations are often accused of being conservative and resistant to change. I'm not sure that's necessarily accurate, but that very often is the characterization. Younger generations are often seen as more open, seeking change. Drawing on your own experience in Georgia, do you think that's an accurate portrayal? Does it help us understand popular responses to political change in Georgia today? The difference, if you like, between an older, more conservative generation that experienced the Soviet empire and a younger generation that Gabriel pointed out did not, and therefore is perhaps more open to experiment. Is that something that helps us understand the current situation and the current generational differences?
I can, of course, speak only for myself, Stephen. But I personally, I never felt that living through Soviet period, this divided me from younger generation because in my entire professional life, I was standing alongside, young generation, counseling them, guiding, helping my younger colleagues, to navigate the complexities of Georgian and international politics. And I speak about myself and those close circle of my friends. I never saw my generation as kind of gatekeepers. I saw our duty to support. Maybe this Soviet experience, taught us to be cautious. That taught us also that institutions can be, fragile. Leaders can disappoint. Laws can be manipulated. And that's why, the attitude of my generation towards institutions, leaders, the rule of law, I speak about independent Georgia, it always used to be kind of supportive, critical, which, turned into, in a typical, I would call typical post-Soviet Georgian pattern. We habitually begin with enthusiasm, supporting a leader, idea, reform. And when expectations collide with the reality, we swing toward frustration, sometimes all the way into polarization, and in the end, maybe revolution. So I think another problem which experienced my generation is that we believe that the West, especially the United States of America, should somehow do the homework for us, fix our politics, guarantee security, lead us toward, democracy. And nowadays, it includes not only, I don't know how the generation of Gabriel, thinks in that regard, but I think the current opposition, thinks that way. Instead of doing their own work, they will still, think about how Americans, how Europeans, how the European Union is going to help, instead of, doing their own homework, themselves. And I think that I heard when I was ambassador, this, kind of message from my American colleagues: help us to help you. Do your homework, and in case we see that Georgians do their homework, that only in that case, the West Americans can help us.
Right.
So
what I'm hearing from you, Tedo, is that, at least gathering from what you're saying, is that maybe these generational differences aren't so significant. In fact, that across generations, you both share similar attitudes, for example, towards governance and towards the state. I'm sure that Gabriel's generation too is also very skeptical of the state and hostile to it. So let me turn to Gabriel now and ask Gabriel, do you think that this idea of an older generation, a younger generation, which is, the differences in terms of openness to political change, is that a simplification, do you think, or go ahead?
Yeah, first of all, I think that such things are happening in everywhere. Like in every country, the older generation are more conservative. But of course, in Georgian context, things can be a little bit different, because I would call Georgian society as a traumatized society, because what we went through during the 19th, it was not just an economical catastrophe. It was absolute state collapse. I mean, when in one day we lived in a territory and not in a state, right? And this absolute freedom did not truly liberate the people. Instead, it left them absolute powerless. And if you will read the newspapers from the 19th, you will hear that people are asking to bring someone like a Pinochet, for example. I really don't know what kind of an expectation and what they knew about Pinochet. But yeah, people were saying that Georgian needed some kind of a military leader who will take is everything in control. And yes, what GD is doing today, they are manipulating with traumas. They are saying that if in Georgia will be a governmental change, the war will start. There will be a chaos. There will be a catastrophe. And of course, many people believe because for them, because for them, it's even such kind of a stability in which people are very poor. Even such kind of stability is enough for them. Even bad government is better than war and chaos. And that is how Georgian dream is manipulating. But
so,
I still
Gabriel,
think
are they manipulating generations in terms of their own experience? Let's say in Georgia, why is it that people fear war and instability? Would it be the case that perhaps the generation closer to Tedo would be more open to accepting that argument and trying to avoid chaos than, say, your generation? Is there a difference there, perhaps?
because there's a difference because I was born in 1996, and my mind and my memory start from the first half of 2000s. That's why I was grown up in a more or less stable situation. Yes, of course, there was even my family was very low incomer, and we were very poor. But at least there was no chaos, and at least there was a state. And I think this causes a huge differences between the vision of the older generation against the new one. That we know that state exists. And for example, my parents are still afraid that chaos will start. No, not by the changing the government, but they believe that things will end with a civil war, and they are afraid of it. That they don't want that they want, of course, to change the government, but they are afraid of a chaos.
Right.
And of course, it is a trauma-driven thing, and not just an idea.
Let me ask you both now also this question about
I don't hear, Stephen.
Yeah, we lost.
Do you hear?
Generation and or the dealing right.
But no, do you hear, Stephen, or not?
Oh no, I cannot
Okay.
hear Stephen. Kaigarla, hopla.
Maybe he got an internet problem, I think. Maybe we can continue my discussion without Stephen before he returns. I don't know.
Gabriel, if I continue, I hope Stephen can hear our whatever exchange. I think I fully agree with you. Of course, we have generational differences, and because we have generational different experience. But I think both of our generation, my generation and your generation, we agree on values. Yes. Yeah. The difference maybe lies in instincts shaped by history. My instincts are shaped by different history, and your instincts are shaped by openness, impatience, and demand for normalcy. But these are differences between us. But on the other hand, I think there are a lot of things, two generations, yours and mine, share, and these are just values of independence, democracy. We both, generations want to live in a normal, functioning, democratic, state, and so on and so forth. So I think in that regard, yeah, we have differences, but at the same time, there are certain things that unifies us.
Yeah. Stephen, do you hear us or should...
Stephen disappeared.
He returned, but I don't know if he hears. No, he left. Yeah, no, I agree with Tedo, and I will continue like that. For my generation, the biggest impact caused this visa-free travel to Europe, because it is not just a visa-free for high-wealthy travelers, but it is also for everyone. I mean, even low-wealthy classes went in Europe, and they became labor migrants, and they saw how developed country can be. Stephen, do you hear us?
Yeah, I'm back. I'm so sorry. I lost my connection. I hope you both can continue the conversation. I would like to step in if I can now and ask about perhaps the impacts of social change in the international situation and technologies and how that impacts both generations. So, for example, the younger generation today has much greater access to information. They're much more knowledgeable about the uses of technology, which sometimes can be incorporated into protest and civil resistance. How has this relationship with perhaps technology affected the different ways that your generations look at politics and behave and your political behavior today?
Gabriel,
Gabriel, why don't you start on that?
Yes, I can start. First of all, my answer will be about my social networks because I mean, no one believes, but in Georgia, Facebook is a platform of making a politics. I mean, whole discussions goes in a Facebook, and even the official messages and even official statuses from the president or from prime minister are written and published first in Facebook and next into official website. But of course, on the other hand, there's a huge problem is so-called troll boats, which have mastered by the GD. I mean, they are using the troll boats and they are using these manipulative skills in a very high levels. For example, they are using a very kind of a way to somehow to manipulate this people's minds. And also, sometimes I think that sometimes even Prime Minister Gabriel is also a part of it. I mean, he's making a content for troll boats. But on the other hand, this social network became a huge headache for HED also, because Georgia is a very small community and nothing can be hidden because everyone knows each other, and it became too hard to hide something because someone will just say it, someone will upload a video and everyone will see it.
Tedo,
yes, I mean,
go ahead, Gabriel.
Yes, I mean, technology really heavily affected Georgia. It's on both ways. In one hand, GD is heavily using these manipulative skills, heavily using. But on the other hand, this is also a headache for them because Georgian politics are now made in Facebook. I mean, everyone is discussing everything in Facebook.
Tedo, if you would have,
And again,
go ahead.
yeah. Of course, I would agree, with Gabriel, and I agree with you. And the question you pose is very, very important, because social technological, let's put that way, changes influence. But I would look at this, issue from a different angle, because as a representative of my generation, I think that the central issue, Georgian politics, Georgian public life, has its issue is education and depth of knowledge, which and this problem shapes political behavior more than age itself. So, and I think in that regard, and I would appreciate and I would be delighted to hear what Gabriel, as representative of his generation, thinks about that Georgia's central structural problem is not generational, but educational one, if I may put, that way. Education, and I do not mean in that regard, going to school or the universities. Education and depth of political knowledge, which shapes public behavior more than age itself.
Right.
And because of this kind of environment, and Gabriel talked about that, the way the government and the authorities use Facebook, or whatever technological things, society becomes this lack of knowledge and education, vulnerable to simplistic narratives and conspiracy from global deep state,
right,
on Vera region, where I live. And I can talk which region, and I have named quite interesting neighbors, academic, doctors. Well, we have some interesting people from previously criminal life. And I can tell you, walking out in the morning to buy bread or whatever, from time to time I speak to these people, academics, doctors, criminals, just ordinary citizens. And majority of them, they believe that global deep state exists. And there is global war party plotting against Georgia. And there are questions to me saying, no, why?
Yeah, but this is a multi-generational reaction, right? I mean, you're not talking here about particular age cohorts, right?
Unfortunately.
Right. So, maybe we're talking about other factors that have a greater impact on the way that people think, right, and on their political behavior. I mean, for example, Gabriel, maybe I could turn to you. What impact do you think the international situation is having now on Georgian politics? So we've seen not only a shift to the right in Georgia today, but also internationally the rise of right-wing populist movements. Is that something that really, when we're analyzing why it is that Georgia is moving in a different direction, let's say to autocracy, that it's not so much explainable by generational differences, but by maybe an international environment or by social change, rather than simply generational differences. Can you reflect on that?
Firstly, we should not forget that Georgia is a leader country. First, we should not forget that Georgia is a leader country in Europe in terms of equality. I mean, in Georgia, we had the highest difference of low income and high income citizens. And also, I will say that simply being poor in Tbilisi is a totally different experience than being a low wealth incomer somewhere in a province. That also really affects how person perceives the Italian life. And the people who is protesting, including me, we are a little bit more privileged than the others because we received some kind of an education, or we were connected some kind of social spaces which give us some kind of a critical thinking. So that's why I think that only geopolitical situation will not be enough for GD to make such a dramatic change. It is impossible, right? But of course, it is a compilation of many different reasons, and one of them can be, and also must be, this Russian factor, because I clearly remember that before the Russians' second invasion in Ukraine, how GD's rhetoric was changing, and I clearly remember before the war, before the week when the war started, how these pro-Russian political parties went in Moscow and met some Russian deputies. And of course, it was clear that they took some instructions. And of course, they knew that war was starting. And of course, Ivanishvili's bet was on Russia's 3-day victory and about Russia taking Kiev. He bet on it. So, of course, there was geopolitical things also, but mainly, and the main factor is the internal. And it is this social inequality in Georgia and nothing else.
So let me get back to Tedo on that then. I mean, so Gabriel is stressing the importance of social and economic inequalities and how they contribute to perhaps the rise of populist movements. But what I want to ask you, Tedo, because you grew up in the Soviet Union, how do you see generational attitudes towards Russia, for example, changing, and why? I mean, your attitude, your experience of Russia obviously was very different than Gabriel's. How is the Russian factor play a role here?
Oh, I can again. Of course, Russian factor, matters. It used to matter, since Georgia regained, independence. Russia always used to be, part of Georgia's political life. But I can say from my own perspective, and I can say on behalf of my generation of Georgians, a speak generation of Georgians, I mean, those are my friends and my family members, my circle of people, that we, of course, we are skeptical about, Russia. We do not share whatever we hear, from
You're breaking up, Tedo. Yeah. Okay. I carry on.
We want just
Tedo, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. You're breaking up. I think maybe now we could turn to some of the questions that have been posed. Let's see if we have any questions that have appeared. I can't actually see any right now. So no question. Please post your questions. Here we have one. First question here. It says, I want to refer to the very interesting point that Gabriel made about Georgian Dream figuring out on the job and in real time how to operate as an autocratic power. It is often mentioned in modern political discourse that autocratic or authoritarian states support each other globally. I'd like to hear his take on this, whether he thinks Georgian Dream's autocratic tendencies are being supported from the outside, namely Russia and China, and in what ways. And lastly, would both speakers say that anti-autocratic progressive political actors in Georgia are also supported by similar powers globally? So, Gabriel, it looks like we've lost Tedo, so I'm going to hand it over to you. What impact does the international situation and these great powers that are moving towards the right, in particular Georgia's neighbors like Russia and Turkey, impact the internal politics of Georgia?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for such interesting question. First of all, I will answer like this: that I don't think that China, for example, had such a great interest in Georgia like VGD wants to be. Also, I don't think that Russia such heavily wanted Georgia that GD did not have any other the option but not to become a pro-Russian, right? Because Russia was already achieving his strategic interest in South Caucasus, because by controlling South Ossetia and Abkhazia was enough for them. I mean, in my opinion. But Georgia, but Georgia, I don't know how to say it in English, but when you are converting money, and in the end you receive some monnets between a large amount of money and a small as the amount of one. I mean, Georgia was like that. Like a small money which Russia received is out of nowhere. So Stephen, you said about Turkey, but I don't think that Turkey needs pro-Russian neighbor. I think that Turkey, who is a part of NATO, and Turkey has a regional actor, should not want Georgia to be such a radical pro-Russian state. And maybe he wanted more maybe Turkey more wanted to be Georgia, some kind of between pro-Western and pro-Russian, but clearly not to be a very, very radical pro-Russian state. So of course the geopolitical things are working, but I don't think that it is such heavily influenced such our politicians are saying. I don't think like that.
Do you think?
But of course there's a clear interest. But my question is that I don't know how to describe it, but I don't think that's enough. I mean, Chinese interests are not enough because they do not have such clear interest in Georgia. Saudi Arabia does not have such clear interest, and maybe Russia.
Gabriel, is it so much that these international powers have interests, or is it simply that the political direction that they are taking provides a model for Georgia to follow, and B, sort of enables and encourages more populist politics in Georgia when they see, for example, what is happening in the United States? So it's not so much because of a direct interest in Georgia, but maybe simply a modeling that is taking place, or an encouragement that is coming from what Georgian government can observe abroad.
Yes, of course, as they are observing it, and of course they are repeating what is going in West. even from starting of 2014, I clearly remember uh, this nationalistic groups who were copying these narratives, which were going in Germany, for example, this nation pseudo nationalistic narratives with this the Islamic sentiments. And of course, JD is also doing the same. Of course, they are trying to be part of these geopolitical changes. They don't want to be the island of a democracy or the island of something. They want to be a part of it. Because it will be easier for them to survive as the autocracy.
Tedo, you're back with us. Can you reflect perhaps also on the
I'm
changing
back.
international situation and its impact on Georgian politics? I'm thinking in particular of what is happening in the United States. You know, Georgian Dream has been trying to create some form of some connection or some form of alliance with the, let's say, the right-wing politics of President Trump, but not so successfully. But nevertheless, the US has such power in the international community that what the way it changes is going to impact many other countries already has. How is that relationship between the US and Georgia working, do you think, now?
I'm, true believer of one thing, that any international policy of any country, Georgia, US, whatever, European or whatever country in the world, is based on its, internal policy. Georgia's current, domestic policy is so much, chaotic, so much, focused on some personal power, that obviously, Georgia's foreign policy, we can hardly call it, foreign policy, and that's how I started my conversation. That nowadays I'm really very angry and very frustrated person, because I see how this foreign policy metrics, which was, built by generations of Georgians, presidents, prime ministers, diplomats, and whoever, and people, it's, crumbling down. So current Georgian, foreign policy, if you ask me, from my own, it's my personal point of view, and I hope not only my personal point of view, it does not exist, And of course, these weaknesses are, and it's kind of not only tragic and tragic, but it's also tragicomic, because when you are watching statements made by current government representatives, prime minister, or just, chairman of the parliament, or just foreign minister, when they complain that why President Trump and his administration is ignoring, Georgia when we are like them. The problem.
So
we're doing.
I have another question for you, Tedo. Let me continue this, because I have a question directed to you. It says Tedo raised an interesting point that the Georgian opposition needs to, quote, do their homework first before turning to the US and the EU for more assistance. What does that homework look like? What work do current and future generations need to do to build a Georgian model of democracy on a local and a grassroots level? So that's a very important question. What do you think of that? And then I'll pass it to Gabriel.
I think my generation, and I hope, Gabriel would agree, with me. My generation wants to see consolidated, opposition. I do not want to see opposition.
I think we have another similar problem now with the connection. So, Gabriel, I'm
which
going to
agrees on fundamental strategic issues, Also on action. Again, we disappeared.
Yeah, we're having great difficulty hearing you. So I'm going to ask Gabriel to ask a question, and maybe the connection will be stronger when we come back to you. So what about the homework? What is the homework that your generation perhaps could do to create a Georgian model of government, Gabriel, a better model of government, let's say?
Yeah, to be honest, I have never much thought about it, but I would agree on Tedo, what he said, that Georgian opposition must somehow consolidate towards the same goal. Because in Georgia we see that distrust and the alienation from the political elites are so high. I mean, people, as you mentioned, are not just only afraid of changes, but they are also raising the question: who will come? It's okay, we hate JD, but who is going to come? And we see that the Georgian political opposition are not even ready to make an agenda for a protest, and they can't even organize it together. They can even stand together. And of course, I would like to say that my generation's state agenda will be just to build a new kind of political parties, not a leader-based political parties. Well, of course, I say that of course the party should be a leader-based, but leader should not be a party. And in Georgia, we don't have such healthy political parties. We have one-man guided political parties, which have already did a job and can't move forward. And this can be our main goal, my generation's goal, to rise new politicians and new political parties. Because people are really tired of seeing the same faces for 3 decades.
So, Gabriel, if people are so tired of the old political system and the failure of political parties, are there alternative forms, perhaps, of opposition and democracy building that your generation can benefit from? For example, different forms of civil resistance or grassroots democracy, rather than relying, as you say, on political parties that have failed Georgian democracy. Is there a generational aspect, perhaps, to the way in which the younger generation is thinking about opposition and politics?
Yes, of course. In Georgia, we have so many social movements, not only in Tbilisi, but in provinces also, and they are socially based with some problems. They will rise as an answer of some problems. But I think that this everything has its limitations. We can't take a full bet on such social movements. Because right now we need these political agendas, and no one else can do it except of political parties. So what we are doing is these ordinary people. We are standing on the Marusta Valley and protesting. It is our maximum what we can do. Because Georgia needs someone who will produce the politics, who will return politics into policies, into politics. I don't know how to pronounce it well. We need policy in politics.
Right. So another question, Tedo, I'm going to direct this to you. If you can hear me, do you believe? This is following on what Gabriel is saying, and I detect a sense of sort of despair about what the future direction is for the Georgian opposition. But The question is, do you believe that democracy in Georgia is still achievable, considering how migration and hybrid warfare are shaping society? And if so, what ideas or strategy could help us protect and preserve democracy in Georgia? Is it still possible?
I think it's still possible, and at least, I will do my best, and I know that those from my generation do our best, to strengthen whatever we try to accomplish. I mean, Georgian democracy, habits of democracy in Georgia. But I'd like to come back to the question of Georgian opposition, because my generation and those whom I have been, speaking almost every day, discussing the different aspects of, everyday political life. We are in kind of, a Georgian catch-22 situation. So we do not like whatever the current government is doing. We're skeptical about them, but at the same time, we do not like, as I already mentioned, then my voice, disappeared. I'm not that, just optimistic about Georgian opposition. So we, as I say, we are in kind of Georgian catch-22, and in that regard, of course, I think my humble advice would be to forget about, Georgian opposition, because I heard, for example, yesterday, that some observers, including foreigners, argue that the opposition failed to use the momentum of the protests. And I think maybe this, the fact that the opposition lost, the momentum, maybe it's an opportunity, because this is a generational moment that should be, it's, time for generation of Gabriel, those young, Gen Z or Gen Alpha or whatever. It's their time just, to fight for.
Again, we seem to have lost Tedo. So your generation, Gabriel.
Democracy and time leader. And in that, yeah.
Go ahead, Tedo. We've got you back again. Try again.
Yeah, and if it happens, and we just, this protest will produce, new leaders. Yeah, that's the problem of Georgia. We do not have new leaders. We have, old ones. When we speak about Georgian opposition, and we became, skeptical about them. But it's time for the protest, is going on, for more than 1 year, to produce the young generation of leaders in Georgia. It's
Right.
not easy. It should not be, messianic leaders, which Georgians love to have, because we always expect something will come down, from the heaven and help Georgia. No, leaders are born, within this young generation, within, protesters. So, and in that regard, of course, it makes me optimistic about Georgian democracy. And if that happens, and if we, see new leaders emerging, of course, my generation and I personally myself will do my best to help them and support them.
Gabriel?
Yes, of course, I totally agree to Tedo. This is the opportunity to make and to find and to rise in new leaders. But on the other hand, we should not forget that new leaders are maybe only born into the healthy situations, and when they're in autocracy, when they can arrest everyone and kill every voice, and when they are distracting this educational system, this becomes really hard. I mean, from where such a leader should emerge when there are no spaces of it, I mean, there won't be spaces in future.
Let me go back. I mean, okay, we've been talking about younger generation perhaps taking up the reins and continuing the struggle for democratic rights in Georgia, but what about the critique of this sort of generational analysis that really the answer in Georgia maybe is not appealing to a younger generation, but appealing across generations, um, across urban and rural environments, for example, appealing to people of all ages within the context of social and economic deterioration in Georgia. I mean, are we sort of just assuming that generations are driving this, but actually there's a much deeper and broader question here that could change things? If, for example, you've got opposition leaders who could appeal across generations, maybe that's really what's required. Tedo, what do you think?
I think, opposition or whoever leaders, new leaders, opposition leaders, leaders who will, just, appear from the Protestants or the young generation, they should go beyond Tbilisi. They need to go to Georgia. They need to go to regions. They need to talk to what democracy is about. It's about communication with the demos, citizens. It's not only Tbilisi, which is very important, but at the same time, Georgia is much bigger than Tbilisi. So you're absolutely right. Well, people. When I was MP, I traveled a lot, throughout Georgia, specifically when we were located in Tbilisi Parliament, and I was, stopping and talking to different people. These people do not care about quality of democracy. These people care about, daily hardship, the piece of bread, education, would, make their life, easier. So I think, Georgian politicians, including new ones, if they emerge, from the young generation, they need to take that into account and just communicate their ideas to Georgian, citizens of Georgia, which unfortunately, citizens of Georgia in different parts, in different regions of Georgia are kind of cut off, from political process and political reality, what we have in Georgia.
Gabriel,
would you
like? Can I ask Gabriel? Gabriel, would you like to add to that, to what Tedo is saying?
I will continue, and I remember that before the 2024 the elections, there was a huge strike in Chiatura, in the mining town. And during the strike, whole city went on strike. I mean, whole city was striking and demanding more rights and more salaries. And it is unimaginable that not a single opposition leader went in Chiatura, and no one from the opposition side have talked to these people. And I'm saying that this was happening before the elections. I mean, directly before the elections.
Mm-hmm.
And the only one who went in Chiatura was a GD and these proxy businessmen. And of course, they told them that all their demands will be approved after the elections. If you will give us a vote, we will do everything what you say. But of course, they tricked these people. And after the elections, in 1 week, all the mines have closed. I mean, they have closed the whole mines, several of them. And I was just wondering how how you can imagine that there is a strike, there's a whole city went on a strike. And as an oppositional party, you are not even trying to go there and to meet these people. I mean, which kind of a logic can this be driven? I mean, it is impossible to imagine. But in Georgia, that's okay, because Georgian opposition parties only views what the city is saying, what the Tbilisi is saying. I mean, they are legitimate. They are trying to find a legitimate only in the cities, only in Tbilisi or Batumi. So, and what we saw is that GD really won everywhere in the provinces. Of course, there was so many problems, and of course, there was huge fraud, but still.
Right. So Tedo, go ahead. We're coming to an end now. We've got about a few minutes left. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a couple of minutes and then to Gabriel to sum up and reflect on what we've said so far.
Just to pick up where what Gabriel was, speaking about, I fully agree. What we do not understand, we have problems to understand what democracy is about. We think that democracy is only elections, when democracy is a daily, very complex, very torturous, very unpleasant communication with, citizens of Georgia to make them understand, their own, problems, hardships, and to make them understand the way out, because it's not enough just to tell them that, yeah, we have big problems. Politicians should learn that democracy, political process is not just only about elections. It's a never-ending process of communication, persuasion, and whatever. I do not want to talk much about that.
Right. So, Gabriel, could we say the younger generation is better equipped to introduce these new ideas about democracy and how democracy should work?
Yes, of course. Of course, but still, as I said, maybe we have a vision how to make it. But in fact, we also do not know how the state functions. I mean, we want a state building, we want to study it, we want to make it, but still, I think that we still do not know how to do it. But it is just my small.
Right. Well, it's perhaps the practice of democracy making that will give you the experience of how to do it, right?
I mean, at least now, after this process, we understand how important was state institutions. Now we understand it because we saw how it failed, because we saw how GD just repressed every state institution in Georgia, and none of them could make anything. Now we understand it. Because before it, we were too skeptical about the state. That state said, I don't know, like, we can make it better because we are Georgians and Georgians can build a state, or some kind of such really ridiculous ideas. We were always trying not to interact with the state. We were always trying to somehow manage not to have a communication with them. But now we understand that that was a huge mistake.
Right. Okay, good. We're actually coming to the end. So, Tedo, I'm just going to give you the last word, and then we'll have to finish.
Yeah, just again, I want to agree with Gabriel, but also, give him my humble, advice. Of course, it's for his, generation to take a lead, but at the same time, they should not ignore, my generation. Try to engage them at least not to repeat the same mistakes we made.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both very much. And I do apologize for the very poor connections that we've had while we've been trying to discuss this issue, but it's a very important issue, clearly, in Georgian politics today, the role that younger people can play. Unfortunately, of course, a lot of the younger generation are actually leaving Georgia. because of the lack of employment prospects and a political future in Georgia that they can enjoy and with the guarantees that it can provide them. So, again, thank you both very much for this very interesting conversation. And again, I apologize to the people who've been watching for the sort of rather the intermittent breaks that we've been experiencing. But
Stephen, I have one idea, if I may.
Yes, very, very quick, Tedo, because we have to finish.
I have this, bad or good habit to make my cards, before, any presentation. I have these cards, and why not me and Gabriel get together through internet and converge our cards, and maybe we'll produce some kind of, text about whatever we talked with this bad communication, but still we can do it on paper and then pass it to you, and here we are to produce something.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a very good idea, Tedo. Very good. Okay,
But
I'm going to have to stop it.
talk about it. Yeah.
I'm going to have to stop it right now. But thank you again both for this fascinating conversation and for the audience for attending. Please continue to connect and look at our webpage and see what events are coming up. We are, as Nadja said at the beginning, a unique program in Georgian studies in the United States. And we're doing our very, very best in very difficult situation to promote Georgia's visibility and to continue to promote Georgian culture, history, and exchange between Georgian scholars and American scholars. So, I hope that the guests who are watching us could go to our website and see what we're doing and perhaps think about helping us preserve this program. And we do need some financial support and help. So please take a look at our website and see how you can help us. Thanks again, both of you, very much. And I look forward to seeing you both in Georgia when I come this summer. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone.